She was walking home late at night after finishing her long shift. The streets were quiet, only the sound of her footsteps and the faint hum of streetlights in the distance. She carried her small bag, thinking only about getting home, making tea and resting her tired body. Her world felt ordinary in that moment. She did not know her life was about to change in the next few minutes. Suddenly, flashing red and blue lights filled the street, breaking the calm silence. A police car pulled up fast, its tires screeching as it stopped near her. She froze for a second, her heart skipping a beat. Two officers stepped out, their faces hard and unfriendly, hands where we can see them. One of them shouted. She raised her hands, confused. She had done nothing wrong. Her voice trembled when she asked, "Is there a problem, officer?" The other cop walked quickly towards her, pulling out handcuffs. She felt fear crawling up her spine. The officer grabbed her arm roughly, twisting it behind her back, while the first one searched her bag without asking. She tried to speak, tried to explain that she was just coming home from work, but they didn't listen. Their eyes showed no kindness, only suspicion. Within seconds, the cold metal cuffs were tight around her wrists. She gasped, feeling humiliation burn inside her. Neighbors peeked from windows, shocked at the sight, but no one stepped forward. People often stayed silent when uniforms were involved. She wanted to scream, to beg someone to speak up, but the words stuck in her throat. The officers pushed her towards the car, their accusations spilling out quickly. "We got reports of suspicious activity in the area," one said. "You match the description," the other added. She tried to protest. "I don't understand. I didn't do anything. I just finished work." But her words were drowned out by the sound of the car door slamming as they forced her inside. The inside of the police car smelled of old leather and faint cigarette smoke. Her heart pounded as the engine started and the car rolled forward. Every second felt unreal, like a nightmare she couldn't wake from. Her mind rasped, how could this be happening? She had always trusted that if you were innocent, the truth would protect you. But now, with cold steel biting her wrists and strangers deciding her fate, that belief began to crumble. The officers exchanged glances as they drove, muttering to each other in low voices she couldn't fully hear. She caught only fragments. Got her now? An easy case. Fear turned into confusion, then into anger. She wanted to shout at them, to demand justice. But she knew her voice would not matter to men who had already decided. She was guilty. She looked out the window as the streets she knew passed by, blurred by the speed of the car. She thought of her family, her friends, and the people who depended on her. What would they think when they heard she had been arrested? Would anyone believe she was innocent? The car finally stopped outside the precinct. The doors opened and one officer pulled her out roughly. The cuffs dug deeper into her wrists, leaving red marks on her skin. People passing by stared, whispering, their eyes full of judgment. She wanted to scream, "This isn't me. I didn't do this." But again, her voice felt trapped, buried under fear and shame. Inside the station, everything moved quickly. Papers were filled out, questions thrown at her like accusations. Her belongings were taken, her fingerprints pressed onto sheets she didn't understand. They treated her not like a woman, not like a human being, but like a criminal who had already confessed. She kept repeating, "I'm innocent. I don't know what you're talking about." But her words bounced off the walls. Ignored and forgotten, she sat on the hard bench in the holding area, the cold of the metal bars surrounding her. The room smelled of sweat and despair, and the air felt heavy. Every sound, the distant buzz of lights, the clang of doors, the heavy footsteps of officers echoed in her ears. She thought back to only an hour ago, when life had been simple. She had been walking home, free and unaware of the trap waiting for her. Now she was trapped, accused of something she didn't do, her voice silenced by power she couldn't fight. She hugged herself, whispering under her breath that she was innocent. But deep down, a question she never wanted to face started growing. What if no one ever believed her? Her story, in that moment, was not about the truth. It was about survival. And as she sat there, her mind shifted. Fear turned into something sharper. She didn't know how or when, but she promised herself she would find a way to prove them wrong. She would not let her life be destroyed by lies. What she did not know yet, what even the officers did not realize, was that she was far more than an ordinary woman. Beneath her quiet exterior was a strength they could not imagine. The night of her arrest was the beginning of a storm. One that would shake everything they thought they controlled. She sat in the cold cell. Her wrists still sore from the cuffs, her mind racing with confusion. Hours passed, but nobody explained anything clearly. Then, just before midnight, 2 officers returned. Their eyes carried a strange look, something between victory and arrogance. They told her they had evidence against her. She frowned, not understanding what they meant. One officer dropped her small bag on the metal table. He pulled on a pair of gloves and slowly opened it. From inside, he pulled out a small packet of white powder. He held it high, like it was a prize he had just won. Her eyes widened in shock. "That's not mine," she cried. Her voice cracked with fear and disbelief. She had never seen it before. She never touched drugs, not once in her life, but the officers only smirked. One leaned close to her and whispered, "It doesn't matter what you say. The bag was in your possession. That's all the jury needs to hear." She felt her stomach twist. This wasn't a mistake. This was a setup. They began writing in their reports, their pens scratching against paper, turning lies into official records. "Caught with illegal substances," one wrote. The other acted suspicious when approached. She wanted to scream. She wanted to tear the papers apart. But the system felt like a wall closing in, brick by brick. Later, they led her into an interrogation room. A single bright light hung overhead, throwing shadows across the walls. A detective she hadn't seen before walked in, holding a thin file. He looked at her like she was already guilty. "You were seen near the scene of a crime earlier tonight," he began. "We have witnesses. We have proof." He opened the file and slid a photo across the table. It showed a blurry figure on a street corner. It could have been anyone, but they claimed it was her. Her hands shook as she pushed the photo back. "That's not me. I wasn't there," she said firmly. But the detective only sighed. "That's what they all say." The hours dragged on. Questions, accusations, threats, everything was designed to break her spirit. But she stayed strong. She repeated the truth again and again, even when they ignored her. Still, the officers seemed almost pleased, as if this was all part of a performance they had rehearsed many times before. When they finally left her alone, she sat back in the chair, trembling. It was clear now. They had chosen her. She wasn't a suspect they had already decided she was guilty. She was an easy target in their eyes, a young black woman walking alone at night with no power to defend herself. Or so they thought. Meanwhile, outside that room, the officers congratulated each other. To them, it was another case closed, another victory for their records, another number to show the department. They didn't care that it was built on lies. They didn't care that a real criminal was still out there. All they cared about was control, promotions, and power. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly imagine, was who she really was. For years, she had lived quietly, hiding her true past. She worked an ordinary job, lived an ordinary life, blending into the background. No one around her suspected that she was once part of the most elite fighting force in the world. She had sworn an oath to stay in the shadows, to protect her identity for the sake of missions that were still classified as she sat in that interrogation room. Feeling the weight of their lies, something inside her began to awaken. Memories of training came flooding back. The drills, the discipline, the endless nights of pushing beyond her limits. The voice of her instructors echoed in her head. Stay calm. Assess. Survive. She straightened her back. Her fear slowly began to burn into determination. She realized she was not powerless. They might have trapped her in this room, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. Still, for the moment, she let them believe she was helpless. She watched every move they made, memorizing faces, voices, and details. She knew patience was her weapon now. The truth would come out, but first, she had to survive the storm. Outside, the file with her name grew thicker with lies. Inside, she grew stronger with every passing second. The setup was complete. The trap was sprung. But they had made one deadly mistake. They underestimated her. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and cold air, the kind of place where silence felt heavy and every sound echoed. She sat at the defendant's table, her wrists free of cuffs, but her heart chained with fear. This was not the life she imagined for herself. She had trained to serve, to protect, to defend her country. Yet here she was, treated like a criminal, while real criminals smiled in uniform a few feet away. The judge entered, and everyone rose. The sound of shoes scraping against the floor made her chest tighten. She wanted to believe that justice would finally shine here. She wanted to believe that the truth would be heard. But as soon as the prosecutor stood up, she realized the stage was already set. The prosecutor's words flowed like poison, smooth and convincing. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "tonight, we will show you the face of someone who pretends to be innocent, but behind closed doors. She was running dangerous operations in our streets." He pointed straight at her, his finger sharp like a knife. The jury stared, their faces unreadable. She shook her head, whispering to herself, "That's not true. None of this is true." But the lies kept coming. They spoke of evidence planted in her bag. They spoke of witnesses who claimed to see her near a crime scene. Every word twisted her story, turning her life into something unrecognizable. Then came the witnesses. The first was a neighbor she barely knew, someone she had only waved to in passing. Yet he stood there, nervous, and said he thought he saw her near shady people one night. His voice cracked, but the jury leaned in. The prosecutor smiled like he had struck gold. The second witness was worse. A coworker, pressured by the police, told the court that she sometimes came home late and seemed secretive. The room buzzed with whispers, painting her late-night shifts and quiet nature as proof of guilt. She wanted to shout, "I was working. I was just trying to survive like everyone else." But her lawyer placed a gentle hand on her arm, signaling her to stay calm. Her eyes scanned the courtroom. Journalists scribbled notes, hungry for headlines. "Black woman arrested with drugs" was already forming in their minds. The gallery was filled with strangers who looked at her with suspicion, not sympathy. She realized something painful. The court wasn't just a place for truth. It was a theater, and she had been cast as the villain. When it was her turn to speak, her voice trembled. She told them about her work, about her normal life. She repeated over and over that the drugs weren't hers, that the photo was not her. She tried to explain how the police treated her that night. But every word felt weaker compared to the sharp lies of the prosecution. The jury's faces stayed stone cold. Behind her, the corrupt cops sat quietly, their uniforms crisp, their faces calm. To everyone else, they looked like heroes doing their job. Only she knew the truth, that they were snakes smiling under masks. Her lawyer did his best. He argued that the evidence was too convenient, that the timeline didn't match, that the witnesses had no solid proof. He asked the jury to look deeper, to question why the police were pushing the case so hard. But the jury avoided his eyes. Their minds seemed already made up. Days turned into weeks. Each morning, she walked into that courtroom, carrying the weight of shame and fear. Each night, she returned to a cold cell, whispering to herself that she was innocent. She prayed that someone would see the truth, that someone would believe her. But every passing day made hope harder to hold. The media only made it worse. Articles painted her as a danger to society. Photos of her being arrested, with cuffs on her wrists, spread everywhere. People who had once smiled at her in the neighborhood now looked away. She became a stranger in her own city. Yet, deep inside, something was shifting. With each lie spoken against her, with each false witness that stood to gain favor with the police, a quiet strength began to grow. She remembered her Navy SEAL training, the lessons of endurance, of fighting battles not with panic, but with patience. They wanted her broken, but she refused to give them that victory. As the trial reached its midpoint, the prosecutor demanded the maximum punishment. His voice echoed, "This woman is a danger to our streets. She must face the full weight of the law." The jury nodded slightly, and her heart dropped. It felt like the world was against her. But what nobody knew, not the jury, not the prosecutor, not even her lawyer, was that her hidden past was about to surface. She wasn't just an ordinary woman fighting to prove her innocence. She was someone who had faced bullets, bombs, and battles far worse than a courtroom filled with lies. The court of lies was doing everything to bury her. But soon, very soon, the truth would rise like fire. And the liars who mocked her would finally tremble. Asterisk, she sat in her cell after another long day in court, her body heavy with exhaustion. The lies had piled up so high that it felt like they were crushing her. Reporters outside shouted her name like she was a criminal celebrity, the kind no one wanted to be. She kept her head down, replaying every detail of the trial, every false word spoken against her. But while the world saw a woman beaten down, inside her something was stirring, an old part of herself she had tried to bury long ago. Most people only knew her as a quiet woman who worked long shifts and kept to herself. But years before, in a world far from ordinary life, she had lived another identity. She had trained harder than most people could ever imagine. She had pushed her body past pain, her mind past fear. She had stood side by side with the toughest soldiers in the world and earned their respect. She had been a Navy SEAL. The memory of her first day of training came back like a wave. The freezing ocean water, the sand sticking to her skin, the instructors yelling until their voices cracked. Many had quit on that first day, but she hadn't. She remembered running with heavy logs on her shoulder, crawling through mud, carrying teammates when her own legs wanted to collapse. Each trial was designed to break her, but instead, it forged her into steel, and now, damn, in this cell, that same steel began to surface again. She whispered to herself the words her commander once told her. Pain is temporary. Weakness is a choice. You are stronger than they will ever know. She thought about why she had hidden this part of her life. After years of serving overseas, after dangerous missions that left scars on her body and her soul, she had chosen peace. She wanted a simple life, away from blood, away from war. That's why she had never told her neighbors, her coworkers, or even some of her closest friends who she really was. She had wanted to just be normal, but now, that silence was costing her everything. The police thought they had framed an ordinary woman, an easy victim. The prosecutor thought he was fighting against someone powerless. None of them realized they were standing against a woman who had survived firefights, who had infiltrated enemy camps, who had stared death in the eyes and refused to blink. The turning point came late one night when her lawyer visited her cell. His hands trembled as he showed her the newest evidence the prosecution claimed to have found. Another witness, another lie. She looked at him with calm eyes, and for the first time, she spoke words that shocked him. They don't know who I am? Her lawyer frowned, confused. She leaned closer and lowered her voice. "I was a Navy SEAL." At first, he didn't believe her. He thought maybe it was stress, desperation. But when she described her missions, when she named the operations that were still sealed in classified files, his face went pale. "Why didn't you tell me before?" he whispered. "Because I swore I would keep it hidden," she replied softly. "But if I stay silent, they will bury me alive in their lies." The next day in court, her lawyer requested access to sealed records. The judge raised an eyebrow, skeptical, but allowed it. Hours later, classified documents confirmed the truth. She was indeed a decorated Navy SEAL with honors most people could never dream of. The courtroom buzzed with disbelief. The jurors glanced at her with wide eyes. Even the prosecutor, so smug before, lost his words for a moment. The corrupt cops, sitting in the back, stiffened in their seats. Their jaws tightened. For the first time, fear flickered in their eyes. She sat silently, her face calm, but inside her heart beat with a quiet fire. She had not wanted her past to return. She had not wanted the world to know who she was. But now it was out, and the battlefield had shifted. This was no longer just a case about planted drugs. It was no longer just a trial about lies. It was a war between truth and corruption, and she was no stranger to war. The media went wild that night. Headlines exploded across television screens and newspapers. Accused woman revealed as Navy SEAL. Some people still doubted her. Others started to question everything. If she was truly who the records said she was, how could the prosecution's story make sense? Why would a decorated SEAL be involved in petty crimes? The whispers began to change. The same people who had doubted her now wondered if they had judged too quickly. Some even began to suspect the police. The walls of lies were beginning to crack, and through it all, she sat with quiet strength, remembering every lesson from her past. She was no longer just defending herself in a courtroom. She was fighting for something bigger, for truth, for honor, for every innocent person who had ever been crushed by corruption. The hidden past was no longer hidden. And that revelation was the first weapon she would use to turn the tide. The cell was quiet that night, but her mind was anything but. After the revelation of her hidden past, the courtroom had shifted. People were whispering, the media was buzzing, and even the cops who framed her were beginning to sweat. But that didn't mean she was free. She was still locked behind cold bars, still treated like a criminal, still at the mercy of a system that wanted her silenced. She sat on the hard bench, staring at the cracks in the wall. Her hands were clenched tight, her nails digging into her skin. Rage burned in her chest, but so did something else resolve. She thought about everything she had been through, everything the Navy had taught her. In combat, you could lose food, shelter, even weapons. But the one thing you could never lose was your will. If you gave that up, you were already dead. The officers thought they had broken her. They thought by dragging her through humiliation, planting lies, and smearing her name, she would crumble. But they were wrong. They had no idea who they were dealing with. For weeks, she had stayed calm, hoping the truth would speak for itself. Now, she realized the truth needed a voice, a fight. And she was the only one who could give it that. She closed her eyes and let the memories of training return. Cold water rushing over her head during drown-proofing drills. Endless push-ups in the mud while instructors shouted in her ear. Carrying teammates through sand dunes until her legs nearly collapsed. Every moment of pain had forged a lesson. When you think you've reached your limit, you still have more left. That night, she whispered to herself, "They will not win." The next morning, the courtroom was different. She walked in not as a victim, but as a soldier ready for battle. Her lawyer noticed the change immediately. There was no more fear in her eyes. Instead, there was a calm fire. The kind you see in warriors before a fight. When the prosecutor stood up again, his words felt emptier than before. He tried to spin the same lies, but the jury's faces no longer looked so sure. The truth of her past had planted seeds of doubt in their minds. Still, the prosecution pushed harder, calling her past a distraction, painting her as dangerous because of her training. They wanted to turn her strength into another weapon against her. That was her breaking point. For weeks, she had sat quietly, letting others speak for her. But now she couldn't stay silent any longer. She rose from her seat, her voice steady but sharp. "You talk about danger," she said, her words slicing through the air. "Yes, I was trained to fight. Yes, I served in missions you will never understand. But I never used my skills to harm innocent people. The only danger in this courtroom are the lies you are protecting. I swore an oath to serve my country, to defend the weak, to protect freedom. And yet, here I am, treated like a criminal, while the real criminals wear badges and sit behind you." The room fell silent. Even the judge leaned forward, listening. Her voice carried a weight that no lawyer, no witness, no journalist could match. It was the voice of truth, sharpened by years of discipline, powered by unshakable resolve. The corrupt cops shifted uncomfortably in their seats. For the first time, the power they thought they had over her began to crack. They weren't facing a helpless woman anymore. They were facing a warrior who had reached her breaking point. From that day forward, she stopped hiding her strength. She studied every detail of the case. She worked closely with her lawyer, pointing out inconsistencies, questioning every piece of false evidence. She treated the trial like a mission, analyzing her enemies, predicting their moves, and preparing her counterattacks. Her presence in the courtroom changed everything. The jury began to see her not as a criminal, but as someone fighting against impossible odds. The media, once so quick to paint her guilty, now questioned whether the police had gone too far. And the public, watching from outside, began to rally behind her. But inside her, the breaking point wasn't just about fighting back in court. It was about survival. Every night in her cell, she thought about how close she had come to losing herself, to believing the lies, to giving up. That breaking point had forced her to choose to stay silent and be destroyed, or rise and fight with everything she had. She had chosen to fight, and though she still didn't know how the trial would end, she knew one thing with certainty. She would never again let anyone decide her worth. The cops could plant lies, the prosecutor could twist stories, but they could not erase who she was. They could not erase the truth. The breaking point had not shattered her. It had forged her into something stronger, sharper, unstoppable. And the system that thought it had crushed her was about to learn that the woman they framed was not a victim at all. She was a Navy SEAL. And she was just getting started. Asterisk, the day of the big hearing arrived. And the courtroom was more crowded than ever. Reporters filled every seat, cameras clicked outside, and whispers spread like wildfire before the judge even walked in. Everyone wanted to see the woman who had been accused of crime but revealed to be a Navy SEAL. The tension was so thick that even the air felt heavy. She sat quietly at the defense table, her back straight, her face calm. But inside, her pulse was steady, controlled just as it had been during missions in war zones. She had reached the moment she knew was coming. The lies were about to collide with the truth, and when they did, someone was going to fall. The prosecutor walked in with his usual smugness, but his steps were not as confident as before. He knew the atmosphere had shifted. He had lost the element of surprise, and now he was standing on shaky ground. Still, he tried to play strong, slamming his papers on the desk and whispering to his team. The judge entered, and silence spread across the room. Court is now in session. The first hours were filled with the prosecutor's arguments, recycled lies, and twisted narratives. He tried to paint her military past as something dark, even dangerous. "This woman has skills most people can't imagine," he said loudly, turning to the jury. "She knows how to fight, how to disappear, how to manipulate. Do we really believe someone like this is innocent?" The jury's eyes flickered with doubt, not about her, but about him. The more he spoke, the more desperate he sounded. And then came the moment her lawyer had been waiting for. He stood up, holding a thick envelope sealed with an official stamp. "Your Honor," her lawyer began, "we have obtained permission to present classified documents that reveal the truth about my client." The prosecutor shot up, furious. "This is irrelevant. Her past doesn't erase her crimes." But the judge raised a hand. "Sit down, counselor. Let's see the documents." The lawyer carefully opened the file, the courtroom leaning in, every breath held. He placed the documents on the judge's bench, then turned to the jury. "This woman is not who the prosecution says she is. She is not a criminal. She is not a threat to society. She is a decorated Navy SEAL, one of the few women in history to complete the grueling training. She has served in multiple classified missions overseas, missions that saved lives. Her record is one of honor, courage, and sacrifice." Gasps filled the room. Reporters scribbled furiously. The jury's faces changed from stone-cold doubt to open shock. Even the judge leaned back in his chair, eyebrows raised. Then came the photos, official military records. Images of her in uniform, medals pinned to her chest. Her name listed on mission logs, citations for bravery under fire. The courtroom, once so sure of her guilt, now looked at her with awe. The prosecutor tried to object, his voice cracking. "This doesn't change the evidence," but the lawyer cut him off. "It changes everything. Because this so-called evidence was planted. They thought she was an easy target. They never imagined she was a Navy SEAL, trained to survive lies, trained to spot deceit. These officers who sit here today underestimated her, and now their lies are falling apart." All eyes turned toward the corrupt cops in the back. Their faces were pale, their bodies stiff. One of them clenched his jaw so tight it looked painful. Another shifted in his seat, avoiding eye contact with anyone. They looked less like heroes now, and more like trapped men who realized the truth was catching up to them. She remained silent, her expression steady. She didn't need to speak. Her past spoke for her. For years, she had kept it hidden, wanting a quiet life. But now, the world knew. The Navy SEAL inside her was no longer a secret. The courtroom buzzed with energy. Whispers filled the room. "A SEAL. She's a SEAL." Reporters rushed to get every detail. The jury leaned closer. Their faces no longer cold, but questioning. Skeptical of the prosecution's story, her lawyer ended the session with words that echoed like thunder. This woman defended her country. She risked her life to protect others. And now, her own protectors, the police, turned against her. Ask yourselves, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, who deserves your trust? A decorated Navy SEAL, or officers caught in their own web of lies? The judge called for a recess. The gavel hit the wood, but the sound was drowned by the noise of the room. Everyone was talking at once. Reporters hurried out to broadcast the shocking revelation. Jurors whispered to each other. The corrupt cops exchanged nervous glances, their confidence slipping away. She sat quietly, breathing evenly. For the first time since her arrest, she felt the scales begin to tilt. The truth was out. And though the battle wasn't over, she knew the tide had turned. The revelation had changed everything. The liars who thought they could bury her were now the ones sinking. And soon they would drown in the very lies they had created. The courtroom no longer felt the same. Just days before, she had been the one under a storm of suspicion, but now the storm was shifting. The revelation of her Navy SEAL past had ripped open the case like a wound, and the infection inside the lies. The corruption was starting to show. When she walked back into the courtroom, the air was different. Reporters no longer whispered about her guilt. Instead, they whispered about her strength, her secret past, her medals. The jury no longer avoided her eyes. Some even glanced at her with respect, for the first time since her arrest. She felt the weight of the room begin to lift off her shoulders, but the prosecution wasn't ready to give up. The prosecutor's voice rose louder each day, desperate, trying to claw back control. He accused her lawyer of tricks, of distracting the jury with her military past. "Don't be blinded by medals," he shouted. "Look at the evidence." But the evidence was starting to crumble. Her lawyer, fueled by her determination, dug deeper. He requested reviews of the so-called witnesses. One by one, cracks began to show. The neighbor admitted under pressure that he had only spoken because the police told him she looked suspicious. The coworker admitted he had been threatened if he didn't testify. He might lose his job. Every lie began to rot under the light of truth. Then came the biggest blow. Surveillance footage surfaced from a nearby street camera. The grainy video showed the night of her arrest. The blurry figure the cops had used as proof clearly wasn't hurt, was someone taller, heavier, moving in a way completely different from her own build. The courtroom gasped when the video played. The prosecutor's face turned red as the defense paused the footage frame by frame. Her lawyer stood tall. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is the foundation of the prosecution's case. And now you see it's built on sand." The jury's faces hardened. This time not at Herb, at the prosecution. The corrupt cops in the back shifted nervously again. They whispered to each other, their confidence cracking like glass under pressure. They had been sure no one would dig this deep. They had been sure their plan would bury her forever. But now, it was their own lies being buried, and she once silent was no longer quiet. She watched them, every movement, every twitch. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her silence now was power, a reminder of who she really was. She wasn't the one trapped. They were outside the courthouse. The tide was changing too. Protesters began to gather not against her, but against the system that had tried to destroy her. Signs were held high. Justice for the innocent. Stop police corruption. We believe her. The same media that had once painted her as guilty now ran headlines questioning the police department, questioning the case, questioning the truth. Inside, more surprises came. An officer not involved in the original setup came forward, breaking the silence. He admitted he had seen strange behavior the night she was arrested, that evidence bags had been switched, that reports had been edited. His voice shook, but his words were clear. Something wasn't right that night. It was the first crack in the wall of silence among the police. And once one spoke, others began to. The thin blue wall the corrupt cops had hidden behind began to collapse. By the end of that week, the trial no longer looked like her battle. It looked like theirs. The prosecutor stumbled over words. The jury looked disgusted. The judge leaned forward with a glare that made the cops shrink in their seats. She sat with calm strength. The same way she had sat in a war zone, waiting for the right moment to strike. She had reached her breaking point before, and now she was watching the enemy break. The turning tide wasn't just about her innocence anymore. It was about exposing the truth. The courtroom, the city, maybe even the country, everyone was watching. And the cops who thought they could silence her had now put themselves under the spotlight. For the first time, she saw fear in their eyes, not the fear of being caught in a lie, but the fear of losing everything. Their badges, their power, their freedom. She didn't smile, but inside she felt a surge of strength. This was what the tide of justice looked like when it finally began to shift. She had been their victim, but now they were about to become their own, and she knew the real storm was still coming. Asterisk, the final day of the trial arrived. The courthouse was overflowing. Reporters packed the steps outside, cameras flashing like lightning. Inside, every seat was filled, and people stood shoulder to shoulder along the walls. The air vibrated with anticipation. Everyone knew something big was about to happen. She entered quietly, walking with steady steps. She didn't wear a uniform, but her posture spoke louder than any badge or medal could. She carried herself the way a warrior carries herself, calm, controlled, but unshakable. People watched her as if she was no longer the accused, but the one holding power in the room. The prosecutor still tried to fight, his voice loud, his words sharp. But the energy had shifted beyond his reach. He looked less like a man seeking justice and more like someone trying to defend the indefensible. His arguments, once smooth, now sounded desperate. His evidence had been ripped apart piece by piece. His witnesses exposed as liars, his case crumbling like sand in his hands. Then it was time for the defense. Her lawyer stood tall, his voice strong. He spoke not just about her innocence, but about what this case revealed: how corruption had poisoned the very people sworn to protect. He reminded the jury of the planted evidence, the manipulated witnesses, the lies in official reports. And then he turned toward her. This woman is not a criminal. She is a soldier. She is a protector. She fought for this country with honor. And now she fights for her own life against those who betrayed everything they swore to uphold. Ask yourselves, who truly deserves justice today? The room went silent. The jury's eyes shifted toward her. In that silence, even the walls seemed to hold their breath. When the judge called for the verdict, every heart pounded. The jury filed in, their faces stern. Time slowed. She sat perfectly still, her breathing steady, as if waiting for the crack of a rifle on a battlefield. The foreman stood. His voice rang out clear. Not guilty. The words echoed like thunder. For a second, she couldn't breathe. Then the room erupted. Gasps, cheers, whispers. Reporters rushed for their phones. The crowd outside roared as the news broke. After weeks of lies, weeks of humiliation, weeks of fighting for every breath of truth, she was finally free. But justice wasn't finished yet. As the courtroom buzzed, the judge slammed the gavel for silence. His voice was cold, sharp. This court finds reason to investigate the officers involved in this case. Their conduct raises serious questions of corruption and abuse of power. They will be taken into custody immediately. The two corrupt cops froze. Their faces drained of color. For the first time, they felt what she had felt the night they framed her, the sudden shock of cuffs snapping around their wrists. The same steel they had forced on her now locked around their own hands. The crowd gasped, then applauded. She watched quietly as they were led away, their heads low, their arrogance gone. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply breathed a long, steady breath of freedom. Justice wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. And the truth had finally spoken. Outside the courthouse, the crowd cheered as she walked down the steps. Cameras flashed, microphones shoved forward, voices shouted her name. But she didn't rush to answer. She paused, looking at the sea of faces, some angry, some hopeful, all watching her. Her voice was calm, but it carried across the crowd. I stood accused of crimes I did not commit. I was betrayed by those meant to protect us. But I fought because the truth matters. And I fought not just for myself, but for everyone who has ever been silenced by corruption. Justice is not easy. It takes courage. But today, we proved it is possible. The cheers rose higher. Her words spread across television screens, newspapers, and phones around the world. She was no longer just the woman who had been framed. She was the woman who fought back and won. A symbol of resilience, a reminder that power built on lies can never stand forever. That night, when she finally returned home, she sat quietly with a cup of tea, the same way she had wanted on the night of her arrest. The world outside buzzed with her story, but she allowed herself one moment of peace. The battle was over. She was free. Yet deep down, she knew this was not just her story. It was bigger. It was about exposing darkness, about showing others they could fight too. She had been underestimated, humiliated, framed, but she had risen. And in doing so, she had changed everything. Justice had been served.